The cruel massacres that once ravaged Colorado's vast pasture lands have left behind few memories of the fighting men and innocent victims in the state's longest conflict.
The sheep and cattle wars are a disturbing episode in Western American history.
The sheep and cattle wars raged the length of public land in Colorado on both sides of the Continental Divide, from the New Mexico border all the way to Wyoming.
Between 1885 and 1934, we see cattlemen, we see sheepmen murdered. There's truly blood on the range.
But these pastoral battlefields could also be a paradise for raising the fatted calf and lamb, for making a home and a life.
I grew up following a sheep, basically, just like my father did, and my mother. It was in our blood.
Our family's been producing beef in western Colorado for 5 generations.
Although it was an undeclared war, it became an all-out struggle for survival between the factions that fenced each other out or trampled each other's rights.
They fenced everything. Barbed wire and fences put an end to that free range.
We have Hispanic families in the valley who have prospered and survived all of that, and still today have their land. In our family, that wasn't our story.
Anybody who was planning to be nostalgic for the colorful old days of the West will just have to get over that.
Even today, hostility still haunts Colorado over the senseless slaughter of animals and people. It's a legacy of hatred and healing from the great civil conflict that became infamous as the Sheep and Cattle Wars.
This program was made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional support from these organizations and viewers like you. Thank you.
In 1873, the scientist Ferdinand Hayden followed his successful geologic and geographic survey that made Yellowstone the first national park by turning his attention to mapping Colorado. Hayden thought it would be the next best place for the rapid expansion of railroads and agriculture. But the other experts on his expedition saw little practical use for what they described as the stunted sagebrush and alkaline soils of the western slope. And a New York Times correspondent on the trip also dismissed it as a desert.
They reported back that it was a place unfit for human habitation, that it was absolute desolation, that there was absolutely no way anything could grow or prosper in the valley.
Although the landscape didn't look very promising, there was plenty of it. And after the U.S. government forced the Ute people out of western Colorado in 1881, settlers saw it as free for the taking.
We don't have much vegetation per acre, but we do have a lot of acres of land. Agriculture has always been one of Colorado's top industries. And for many years, ranching survived by having an abundance of open land. At the end of the Civil War, the United States appetite really shifts away from pork and really is interested in beef. Beef turns into the all-American food. And as expansion moves to the west, pigs don't do very well. Cattle is a food source that does do well in these really dry regions of the American West.
After the Civil War, there's a lot of cattle roaming around Texas, and it's been disrupted and it's chaotic, so there's a lot of opportunities to seize that cattle and to start bringing the cattle north.
Taking advantage of that water, taking advantage of the wide open spaces, pretty soon, cattle ranching becomes the dominant industry in western Colorado.
Certainly that was the big economic driver in the area at that time, where was the beef. It was certainly needed here by the miners that were here, and the community, as it began to grow, had an appetite
And with a growing country that was hungry for all the meat the new Western Colorado railroads could deliver, the cattle barons were even more ravenous for a bonanza of beef, raised on cheap land with flourishing feed and flowing water.
Millions of acres of open land. Millions of acres that nobody has any claim to. Millions of acres of land owned by the federal government that nobody is currently using.
Water was abundant and the grass was green and it just seemed like a perfect place.
Especially for the early trailblazers who made Colorado into cow country by enforcing one of those unwritten but ironclad codes of the West.
We started developing a system of first in time, first in rights. But basically what it says is that if you were a rancher and if you came to an area, that area is yours. But this first in time, first in right also came with problems. Because there's no true legal vessel to give you the rights to that land.
That put the law on the side of the farmers who were backed by Abraham Lincoln's 1862 Homestead Act, and the free-ranging sheep herders who took their own license to graze on public lands.
Cattle ranchers found themselves fighting on two fronts. One was from new operations coming in, and people homesteading the land, from people actually farming the area. They also saw competition from the sheep industry coming. And so pretty soon we started finding ourselves in the range wars.
Really, the conflict focuses almost completely on winter grazing. And you simply cannot have cattle and sheep in the same place at the same time without conflict.
Those skirmishes were constant, and it was really about range. And that was about grass, and it was about water, and so it was about survival. And the cattlemen saw everything the sheepmen stood for as a threat to their continued survival.
And the more their flocks prospered, the more sheepmen like Teofilo Trujillo were thought of as a threat.
My great-great-grandfather, Teofilo Trujillo, came up with livestock. He came up through San Luis and then moved up into the area by the sand dunes. He wanted to raise sheep. And at the time, lots of the Hispanic families were doing the sheep raising. They lived in an adobe house. It was one of the nicest houses, they said, in the area. They had stained glass windows. We know that it was one of the largest ranches in this part of the valley. They were growing big, and they were successful, they were prospering, they were a threat. The cattlemen were saying that the sheep were grazing too close to the ground, and so that was destroying some of the pasture. They weren't able to graze their cattle like they wanted to. They felt like it was harmful to the land.
That's what starts the clashes. Herded sheep, if you've got a band of 1,000 or 2,000 ewes, and you get into an area, you can graze the area. You can take the sheep right where you want to take them. Now the cattle usually will scatter out and you'll have a few head everywhere. If many bands of sheep come into an area, they can wipe the area out. And there's nothing left for the cattle.
Now we have massive competition for the same land. You have cattle ranchers who feel that they were there first and that this is their right to that land. You have sheep herders coming in, filing homesteads or moving into the land saying they have just as much of a legal right as the cattlemen.
My father came from Greece in 1912. They ended up in Price, Utah, and they worked in the coal mine. But he came over with his brother, and slowly they accumulated enough money to buy a few sheep. They didn't own any land, but they just went where the grass was. They trailed him by foot. My mother used to say he had overshoes at one time and they wore out. That's how it was. How the sheep business got started in our family.
It was really easy for the first couple of cattle operators to say, well, this is my free grass and this is my opportunity, but we can't have the third and fourth other people come in. Those are range pirates. Those are people coming into our area, and we're here first.
Once barbed wire was patented in 1874, it spread its thorny tangles into Colorado. Suddenly, the warring forces became even more entrenched on either side of the fences that scarred the land. While these barriers saved the farms of many homesteaders, they also shaped a chaotic battlefield for many decades to come.
The homesteaders started coming in, started claiming the better parcels of land that had the water. Then the big outfits would come in and start to push their way around, and then The little guys would start rustling a few cattle. Then you had barbed wire.
Barbed wire had put an end to the range, the free range that you had to have for cattle. And you could fence off the water sources because some homesteader homesteaded that. And so there was no water for those cattle. They fenced everything. It totally just destroyed the ability for the cattle barons or the cattlemen to even have what had become the norm for them for that 30, 40-year period before. It put an end to that free range, barbed wire and fences. There's just no question about it.
It made it hard for the big cattle outfits to survive because they didn't have the free rein or the trail from one end to the other without going through a homesteader or somebody that wouldn't let them go.
Even after the superintendent of the U.S. Census of 1890 declared that the West had finally been settled, a free-for-all brawl was about to break out amongst the big cattle companies, smaller ranchers, farmers, and sheepmen.
By the 1890s, it's a grim scene. Some of that is mystifying because by some views of Western American history, that's when the frontier closed in 1890, when things calmed down, when a more orderly form of living and being with one's neighbors settled in.
Not everybody was ready to be neighborly or to give up their wild Western ways, especially in the face of rumored invasions by foreigners, trailing sheep across traditional cattle pastures.
The 1890s were especially bloody. During the 1890s, there was a big worry amongst Montrose and Mesa and Garfield counties that thousands upon thousands of sheep were going to enter the area from Utah. And so the cattlemen in the area decided to take this issue into their own hands. And sadly, this oftentimes was in a very violent way. One day in September of 1894, John Holbert came to Grand Junction to celebrate the Peach Day festivities, and he left his sheep herd behind. He had about 3,400 sheep. And on that day, masked men, about 40 of them, went up to the sheep herd, and they massacred all 3,400 of the sheep. Some were clubbed to death, some had their throats slit open, some had their legs broken so that they could not move. Many of them actually were suffocated by having other sheep on top of them. John Holbert came back and he was absolutely devastated and he was financially ruined.
It was just the kind of screaming and bleeding headlines that would sell local papers and start their own war of words.
Many of the newspapers in Fruita took a lot of sympathy for the cattlemen. They're the ones building a community, they're the ones paying taxes in this area. Who are the sheep herders coming in and taking their land and their opportunity? Some of the newspapers in Grand Junction saw it slightly different, and they said, this is still the destruction of property. This is still taking something from somebody else. To create even more competition on this limited resource of great grazing areas, in the 1890s, there's a big push to pull out lands from grazing and create timber reserves.
Then, in February of 1905, President Teddy Roosevelt, who had been a cowboy and became an early conservationist, signed an act of Congress that created a more powerful and controversial U.S. Forest Service. Its expanded federal control of timberlands, grazing rights, and fees was described by one cattle-friendly newspaper editor as semi-socialistic nonsense.
Theodore Roosevelt was a former rancher, and he had seen things go well, and he had seen things go badly from unrestrained resource use.
Teddy Roosevelt believed in, quote, small farmers and small ranchers. So he really wanted the Homestead Act to succeed. He did not want the large Texas cattle herds that had damaged so much of Colorado's ecosystems. Neither did he want the large Basque sheep herds.
So that regulation of grazing on the forest reserves and the creation of the Forest Service to govern that, that's a Roosevelt project. But that, in some ways, adds to the pressure cooker quality because there's less access to public lands.
And more reason for men like George Woolley of Craig to try sheep as a means of economic survival, even if it meant betraying his cattle background and risking retribution, which came swiftly at the hands of night raiders.
It was about income, and it was about making a living in a difficult area that had long, cold winters and short summers. And he got into the sheep business. And so he had put sheep up on the public domain up in the forest for one season, had a lot of them wintering out here just east of Craig. And all of a sudden they thought, we aren't going to let that happen. So they cut the wires coming into the ranch, they cut the telephone, and there was only one boy by the name of Louis Eberly taking care of the sheep. Willie was actually in Denver getting more sheep to come in the spring. And so they actually clubbed all the sheep. I think only one or two of that whole group survived.
The nation was fascinated and aghast at the accounts of such massacres, and public opinion was swaying against acts of cattle-driven violence. But the sheep and their many immigrant herders were still easy targets for slaughter and propaganda.
One of the names that they call sheep is range maggots, which is certainly not a complimentary term for sheep. They'd hate sheepmen because of what they stood for and everything about them.
You have a lot of Basque, you have a lot of Mexican Americans, you have a lot of Greeks running the sheep industry. And so we do see racial tension. We see the cowboys, the cattle, that's all American. The sheep, well, that's something coming into our lands. That's something being introduced not by the red-blooded Americans.
The cattle moving through the state are often Texas herds. And Texas cowboys were extraordinarily racist, extraordinarily hard to get along with, hard drinking, hard riding, and very used to pushing Hispanic herders around.
There was one incident where these cowboys came through and killed some of the sheep, quite a few of the sheep, and the prize ram. There was a prize ram that Teofilo was very proud of, and that was killed. The head of the prize ram was hung up for them to see, like, look, this is your warning. They were going to a hearing over what had happened. The family was in the wagon coming home. Very, very cold at night, and could see flames. The house was totally destroyed. They lost, their house. They lost some of their outbuildings. That was what finally made them decide we can't stay here because their lives were threatened. And after they had been there for 40 years, working hard, they had to leave. They then decided to sell. Everything that they did to build things from nothing to build one of the largest ranches in Colorado. They had to leave. No one ever had to pay for what they had done.
How bloody were the sheep and cattle wars? Hard on the sheep. Thousands of sheep were killed. We will never have an accurate account of how many herders who may have been shot or wounded or killed.
Once we start seeing very gruesome events, once we start seeing occasions where sheep herders are being massacred and herds of sheep are being massacred on lands traditionally set aside for sheep grazing, we start having people question, well, what really is right here?
These things were news at the time. News at the time that's saying that this innocent elderly man who was, upstanding citizen. The news was that what was happening down in the southern states was now coming up to the valley. Like, we're having this in the valley. Look what happened to Teofilo Trujillo. Look what happened.
If you look at the chaos in western Colorado at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, then you don't have to walk around bewildered asking yourself, why is there so much federal authority over land? Where did that come from? Why did that seem like a good idea?
The issue is finally largely resolved in 1934 with the passage of the Taylor Grazing Act. Edward T. Taylor was a western Colorado congressman. He saw that this issue really needed to be resolved, that there's no way that we can continue having this conflict out on the range. And so Taylor proposed a very radical idea, and that was, let's take this approximately 142 million acres that had not been homesteaded upon, and let's remove that from the public access for homesteading, and let's create grazing districts. Let's redraw the map.
There were low expectations and less support for Taylor's revolutionary act. But the first director of grazing, Farrington Carpenter, who was described as having the peculiar qualifications of being both a cattleman and an attorney, showed the wisdom of Solomon by convening a summit in Grand Junction where he urged the warring forces to split up the contested territory to their own satisfaction or let the federal government draw the lines for them.
He He sat down with the sheepmen and the cattlemen, and he said, we're going to figure out these grazing districts. I want 10 representatives from the sheep industry, 10 from the cattle industry, and we're going to take this map and we're going to divide it up. And he got buy-in by saying, either I can make this decision for you and people on the East Coast can make this decision for you, or you can help me make this decision. And so it was the people that helped create these grazing districts. It was the ranchers on the land.
Bringing the government, if you will, into it, I think that helped to educate producers to some extent. I'm sure that it also felt like they were being choked for a while.
I used to, in my Western American history classes, I used to have a competition for the most significant event in Western American history. And because I wanted to win, I often, for myself, chose the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, because it is the statement that says we will have to work in a different manner.
The Taylor Grazing Act marks the end of the sheep and cattle wars. For the most part, the very violent days, the days of the cattlemen saying that we're going to stop sheep from coming into Colorado, even if the blood flows all the way up to the horse's bridle, are largely done.
After so many years of acrimony on the grazing lands of Colorado, cattlemen and sheepmen finally realized cattle and sheep can graze together.
You have more people realizing it makes economic sense to have sheep, that these two animals can actually sort of benefit themselves and each other if you work on not overgrazing, because sheep eat things that cattle don't eat.
And season after season, the meat and wool of the sheep made their shepherds rich in money and in land.
The sheepman gets a lamb crop once a year, plus a wool crop. So the sheep guys made 6 times the money the cattleman has. They just bought banks, they bought ranches, they bought thousands of acres. They will buy high mountain meadows. And those high mountain meadows will, by the 1970s, become the bases for some of Colorado's most elaborate and expensive ski areas.
I grew up following a sheep, just like my father did, and my mother. You know, basically it was in our blood. But I liked moving cattle. I just liked being with the cows. A little more satisfactory because I had more hands-on. I could control it better. It fit my soul better than the sheep did.
My grandpa was one of the very early innovators in running sheep and cattle together. It was a management decision to bring the sheep in and move the sheep through, particularly in the high country, on the forest, bring those sheep in and let them graze off the poison, if you will, larkspur, giant larkspur, some of those kinds of issues that were poison to the cattle.
In the post-war period following the 1934 Taylor Grazing Act, the benefits of conservation and regulation and even cooperation have created a less toxic and hostile environment.
Nobody has to fear going to the Western Slope in the 21st century. Nobody has to fear that they'll get caught in a crossfire between cattlemen and shepherds. That's nothing to take for granted.
For the casualties of the more than 40-year blood feud, some old wounds are still raw, and suspicions still linger.
It does still hurt because you think, what if? If it had been something where they had been able to hang on to their property. Some Hispanic families did. You know, we have Hispanic families in the valley who have prospered, who have made it through and survived all of that, and still today have their land. In our family, that wasn't our story. Because of the situation and having to leave the way they did, they were in a hurry to sell.
When we go out on these ranges that are unfenced, down to the west here, there's some hostility there. Sheepmen don't like to see cattle on their range. Not at all. It's okay if they go on somebody else's range. They don't want any cattle on their range, I'll guarantee you. It's alive out there. It's still alive, guaranteed.
Today, many of the war's descendants have made their peace in this land of droughts and bounties by sharing the labors of making a sustainable home on the range where cattle and sheep are both appreciated.
My father-in-law, they were out someplace and found a stray lamb. So he took the stray lamb and put it in the Cadillac, in the car. And somebody said, well, what are you doing with that lamb in your Cadillac? He said, well, that's that lamb that bought this Cadillac, so he can ride in it too.
This is good country. We all say that we can wean bigger calves, which we sell pounds. We can wean big calves off the Uncompahgre out of the Unaweep. We talk about that a lot. So it is good feed. It's naturally a good feed.
The sheep really, they took care of the land. The herders, they knew when to graze them, when not to overgraze them. They took care of everything.
We're doing our best to sustain the resources in caring for the land and caring for the animals. So I think those are some really important pieces that have been passed from generation to generation.
We were shepherds of the earth and of the animals too, and of our people too.